David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
As I told you months ago, he would be doing it. Bernie Sanders has announced he is running for president. He announced in exactly the month, February 2019, that I was told by someone close to Bernie in 2018 that he would be doing it. The part that hasn't worked out as predicted is that when I was told Bernie would be announcing in February 2019, the idea was that it would be one of the first announcements. And in fact, he is something like the, I don't know, roughly 10th or 12th Democratic candidate to declare that he is seeking the Democratic nomination in 2020. Can we say that Bernie is now the front runner? I don't know. Let's think it through. I mean, the differences from 2016, for sure, Bernie coming into the beginning of the primary process with way more name recognition. I mean, just exponentially more than in 2016. He's known now within the United States Senate or by the United States of America as being the furthest left senator within the United States Senate. That's a difference from 2016. And there's also this big contingent that believes Bernie Sanders would have defeated Trump in 2016 had he been the nominee rather than Hillary Clinton. So that all is in favor of Bernie now being the de facto frontrunner. On the other side of this is a contingent, and I don't know how big it is. I'm trying to assess how big it is. That's quite frankly furious with Bernie Sanders because some believe, cost Hillary Clinton the presidency in 2016. I don't believe that, but there's a contingent that does believe that. All sorts of progressives on my Facebook page saying they don't know who they're voting for, but they're definitely not voting for Bernie. Some mentioning this thing about they are Democrats and Bernie isn't. So that is the reason some are citing that they will not be supporting Bernie Sanders in 2020. My message to people who are really angry with Bernie is that Medicare for all being talked about as much as it's being talked about today by the Democratic candidates is because of Bernie Sanders. Tuition-free college being discussed today in the way that it is because of Bernie Sanders in 2016. People like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and that contingent in Congress today is significantly, Bernie Sanders is significantly responsible for that movement, which led to the election of many of those candidates. The idea of not taking PAC money, something we can connect to Bernie Sanders. So for me right now, it's not really that important whether he is the front runner or not. He's certainly no longer the underdog, as he may have been considered in 2016. He is without a doubt a top contender. Cory Booker, Peter Buttigieg, Julian Castro, John Delaney, Tulsi, Kirsten Gillibrand, Klobuchar, Andrew Yang. Bernie is certainly immediately ahead of them. I would put him along with Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris probably as the front runners right now. But I don't even think that's really the important conversation to be having at this point in time, because front runners in February of the year before the election don't typically end up being the nominees. Now, typically kind of goes out the window. Donald Trump is president of the United States, but think back to Richard Gephardt or John Edwards. So I don't think it's particularly useful to say who's the front runner right now. What we can do is look at data. On his first day, in only the first 4 hours raising money today, Bernie Sanders has already matched the campaign donations that Kamala Harris received in her entire first day after announcing, in just 4 hours. So there's no question here that Bernie Sanders very quickly is towards the front. I think that the real questions are going to be, has Bernie Sanders done damage to himself by virtue of being so successful in 2016? And what I mean by that is, in 2016, Bernie talking about Medicare for all, tuition-free college, high marginal tax rates on the rich, he was an outlier in discussing that. Now that those ideas, thanks to Bernie, have been so much further mainstreamed, he no longer stands out as the only candidate who supports those things. Now, of course, with Medicare for all, there's a difference between the Bernie Sanders position, which is Medicare for all is the way, and here's how we would pay for it, and here's a bill I've already introduced to do it, versus more moderate centrist Democrats who are sort of playing coy and saying, sure, Medicare for all would be nice, but I just don't think it's going to happen. And here's some tweaks we can make to Obamacare. So we have Bernie to thank for a lot of that conversation. I think that it may well become an issue that Bernie Sanders is not a Democrat, but caucuses with Democrats in the Senate. That's something I'm already seeing a lot of discussion of on social media. I think that much like with Elizabeth Warren's DNA test fiasco, I think that Bernie Sanders and allegations of sexism, not by him, but within the ranks of his 2016 campaign, is probably going to be made an issue by some of his opponents. And my advice right now would be, let's continue assessing the candidates on their platforms. Let's start to think about what their candidacies would look like up against Donald Trump. I think it's okay to start considering that at this point. And don't try to reason with people who are super pro AOC, but are saying they hate Bernie, because they were born out of the same movement. And I think that that is how the left will destroy itself. We don't want to fall victims to the narcissism of small differences. And that's a phenomena that I'm going to be talking about a little bit later on in the program, and maybe on a live stream this evening as well. So we'll continue following the early candidacy of Bernie Sanders. Not a surprise that he announced, more surprising that he is only like the 10th or 12th candidate to make the announcement. Okay, I'm still preparing a story on the case involving actor Jussie Smollet. It was initially reported that he was the victim of a homophobic attack that involved a rope around his neck and a chemical thrown at him, and attackers yelling, "This is MAGA country." And we now have more and more reason to believe that the truth of the incident is that the entire thing may have been a staged attack. I've been waiting to do a full story about it because I'm trying to figure out the full truth of what exactly took place. But what I have for you today that I do want to talk about is a really cringeworthy video, a face-planting video of 2020 Democratic candidate Kamala Harris being asked about this, and she really doesn't handle it well. It's actually hard for me to imagine her handling it even worse. Previously, Senator Kamala Harris called the Smollett incident a modern-day lynching. She tweeted shortly after it took place, "This was an attempted modern-day lynching. No one should have to fear for their life because of their sexuality or color of their skin. We must confront this hate." Perfectly reasonable thing to say based on what was known at the time. But of course, as I mentioned, it's now appearing more and more that the attack may have been staged. So predictably, Kamala Harris was asked about it, asked about her tweet, and she implodes. She handles it terribly. First, she pretends not to know about the tweet being referred to. Okay, maybe she forgot. But then as she's asked again about it, she looks around, and what it looks like to me is that she's looking for a staffer or a handler or an aide to run interference, to tell the reporter she's not going to answer the question, to say, "We've got to go, sorry, submit your questions in writing," which is just the worst look in this situation. When you're asked a question and you condescendingly look away for someone to pull the reporter away, then look back and laugh, it just looks really bad. But then she just stutters and stammers and says, well, facts are unfolding. And it is one of the worst politician responses I could imagine in this situation. Let's take a look at it.
Which tweet? What tweet?
About saying that it is a modern day lynching, that
sorry.
Yes, Jussie Smollet.
Okay, so I will say this about that case. I think that the facts are still unfolding, and I'm very concerned about, obviously.
Totally cringeworthy. And the worst part is the looking for someone to take the reporter away, or to take her away, or to step into the middle of it. Why not just say, listen, under this administration, we've seen a coalescing and a catalyzing of the worst extremist hate elements. We've seen racist incidents. We've seen anti-Semitic incidents. We've seen the emboldening of the white nationalist right. The president saying he would pay the legal bills of supporters who punch the opposition protesters at his events. I commented on this on the basis of what was reported initially. Sometimes cases are not what they seem. This may be one of those cases. But for the most part, false crime reporting and staged crimes are incredibly rare. We'll eventually know the truth if this was a staged attack. The perpetrators need to be punished. The law prescribes punishment for such perpetrators. That's it. Like, I can't imagine, Pat, any worse response, particularly when there is such a simple and coherent response that she could have given.
Especially because it's not like Kamala Harris did anything wrong by sending out that tweet. I mean, she was reporting on what we all thought was true at the time, may still have been true, but we just don't know. The veracity of the claims haven't been verified yet. So she could just say no comment for the time being. She wants to wait until she hears all the facts out. That's all you got to do.
Even no comment would have been boring, but it would have been better than what she did. And it reminds me of when there are false rape allegations and reporters go to people who said rapists should be punished. This is horrible. And of course, the answer is false rape allegations are criminal. People who do them should be punished. They're also extraordinarily rare. If somebody makes a false rape allegation, if somebody staged an incident like this, they should be punished. Let's not get distracted from the reality that most rape allegations are true and that most crime reports are not crimes staged by the person claiming to be a victim of the crime. So just a total misstep. And quite frankly, sort of surprising for someone as seasoned and typically well prepared as Kamala Harris is. What do you think happened here? Let me know. And if this was a good response and I'm missing something, please let me know. I'm on Twitter at @DPakman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The David Pakman Show is viewer and listener supported media. You can support us by signing up for a membership at www.joinpakman.com. Today, I want to say thanks to our newest member of the day, Cynthia Stillwell. Cynthia, thank you so much. Also want to say thanks to our longtime sustaining member of the day, Patrick Berg, who has been with us almost 5 years. Great day for new members, Cynthia and Patrick. Thank you. You can join them at a 40% discount if you so please, if you desire the discount, by using the coupon code THISIS2020 when you pick the membership of your choice at joinpakman.com. Okay, I told you when Donald Trump declared this bogus national emergency over the non-existent crisis at the U.S.-Mexico border that there would be legal challenges. And indeed, there are. 16 states have now filed a lawsuit over Donald Trump's declaration of a national emergency to try to commandeer money from the military and the Department of Defense to build a border wall. 16 states, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, Hawaii, Illinois, Maryland, Maine, Michigan, Minnesota, Minnesota, almost said Minneapolis, Nevada, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, Oregon, and Virginia, all participating in this lawsuit, which claims primarily that this declaration of a national emergency is a misuse of presidential power. And there's a couple of different ways that this can be argued, and we'll see as this progresses which is the path that actually is employed here. Number one is the argument that historically, and I told you this yesterday in part, historically national emergencies have been used to expedite either funding or action on issues that have bipartisan support. So sanctions on particular people around the world, delivering aid somewhere, declaring a particular situation a disaster zone or a humanitarian crisis or whatever. The idea is there is bipartisan support, and the declaration of the national emergency helps to further the position of the House and Senate in order to more quickly achieve something. Donald Trump's doing the opposite here. There's no congressional consensus for funding his border wall. Donald Trump has chosen to use the declaration of a national emergency not to more quickly do what Congress is trying to do, but to actually do the opposite of what Congress has shown a willingness to do, to circumvent the hesitation of Congress, the House and the Senate, to fund Donald Trump's bogus border wall. So, as I said, if you're a small government conservative, you should be furious at what Donald Trump is doing. If you believe in checks and balances, you should be furious about this decision. If you are against expanding executive branch power and the power of the office of the presidency, which many small government conservatives claim to be against, then you have to be against this. If you don't even care about any of that stuff and you just believe in facts and logic, you have to realize that there is no factual case to be made that there is a crisis on the southern border. The facts just don't bear it out. And I won't even repeat the full list again because it's total broken record circumstances at this point on that issue. Now, there may also be lawsuits coming from red states, the actual border states where the wall would go, because there are right wingers who may, generally speaking, believe that there's an immigration crisis or like the idea of a border wall. But there are right wingers who own land on the border who don't want the government taking their land for the wall, particularly on the basis of a national emergency declared by the president going around the will of Congress. What is really important here is that the lawsuits aren't about the wall per se. They are lawsuits about executive branch overreach on the basis of a declaration by the president seizing money and seizing potentially property, land. And the argument, Pat, is that this makes it a constitutional issue. And the best case scenario is that this takes years to resolve, nothing gets built, and eventually a Democratic president says, there's no more emergency and we're not trying to build the wall. I see that as the sort of best path forward to tie this thing up indefinitely.
That does sound like the right path forward, and everyone knew that these lawsuits were going to happen, including the president himself. He mentioned that during his national emergency speech. And honestly, if the courts do strike this down in time, I don't think he'll care that much. I think he just wanted to deliver this campaign promise to his supporters. And he's going to come to the polls in 2020 and say that I did what I could. I tried to build the wall through Congress. I tried to do it through a national emergency declaration, and the court struck me down and everyone's against me. But his supporters will still view this as an attempt at winning, like he tried to fulfill his campaign promise.
Isn't it sort of weird that they claim to be against socialism, but a lot of them are okay with the government seizing both taxpayer land and taxpayer money by circumventing Congress to build a wall? Aren't those the bad elements of socialism that they claim to be against? It's a very, very strange thing. We'll see what happens now. This could be, we've been reporting on it daily since the declaration of the national emergency, but we may get to a point where there's very little to say about it because it's just going to be tied up in courts for years, which I think would actually be a pretty good outcome. Okay, yesterday we went through the content of Donald Trump's speech declaring a national emergency to try to get the border wall built. And when we talked about this yesterday, I mentioned to you that right after his Rose Garden speech declaring this emergency and talking about how this is all so important and it's all got to be done, Donald Trump immediately went down to one of his golf clubs and was spotted at the omelet station. And apparently I'm not pronouncing omelet correctly, and we'll deal with that later on in the show. And he's pictured grabbing an omelet before or after his golfing. And of course, when you say I'm having an emergency, that's not usually followed by I need a ham and cheese omelet and 3 Diet Cokes immediately. It's usually followed by something related to the emergency that you have declared, right? The U.S.-Mexico border emergency, which requires commandeering funds, circumventing the will of Congress. It's even worse than we thought, because now we have found out that Donald Trump not only golfed right after declaring the national emergency, he golfed 3 days in a row. 3 days in a row of a national emergency so important that it requires, as far as Trump is concerned, circumventing the decisions made by the U.S. House and Senate. And he couples them with 3 days of golfing. Saturday reportedly included 6 hours of golf. Interesting detail. Trump has been showing up to start golfing around 9 a.m. each of these 3 days. Trump doesn't even show up to the Oval Office in the same building where he lives until 11 a.m. on a normal day. He has now made, depending on which numbers you look at, between 159 and 172 visits to golf clubs during his presidency. This is more vacation than most people take in multiple years who are not the president of the United States. And of course, Trump has also made money by making these golf trips to his golf clubs. One example is that over the weekend, a Chinese delegation met with Trump, not at the White House, but at his Mar-a-Lago resort. Trump is playing golf and making money personally while a national emergency supposedly warrants getting around Congress to commandeer money from the military and the Department of Defense. As I was reading about this, it reminded me of this infamous George W. Bush moment where he delivered an impactful statement about terror right before teeing off on the golf course.
We must stop the terror. I call upon all nations to do everything they can to stop these terrorist killers. Thank you. Now watch this drive.
There you go.
All right. You need another.
I don't actually think Trump believes this is really an emergency, Pat. I'm curious what you think. I believe Trump believes 3 million Hillary voters voted illegally in 2016. I believe that because he's privately continued to say it even after the conversation was out of the media. I think Trump probably believes in real life that the Russia probe is a witch hunt. I don't believe Trump actually thinks there is a border crisis that warrants a national emergency. He even said during the Rose Garden speech, I didn't have to do this. I did this because I feel like building the wall more quickly. I believe, Pat, that Trump knows deep down this one is not real.
Yeah, I think he just wants to rally and satisfy his base of supporters. And this vacation time, to me, it sounds like he sees himself as having completed the job. Like he worked so hard to try to get wall funding during the government shutdown debacle, and then that 3-week period when we didn't know if the government was going to be shut down again, that now he deserves a vacation because he did what he had to do. He declared the national emergency, and now we're moving on. He can take a break.
Whatever Trump thinks, we've got to hope that the courts are going to stop this absolutely ridiculous power grab and misuse of the national emergency declaration. Either way, under the best case scenario for the wall builders, not much of this wall is ever going to be built. Even if Donald Trump has 6 more years as president, $8 billion would, in the best case scenario, build some tiny piece of the wall. It would take years. Lawsuits will slow it down, and the next Democratic president will simply be able to end it. So this could change, but unless something radically changes, even on the basis of this declaration, almost no wall is actually going to be built. And then that transforms this from an actual discussion about immigration policy and what can be done pragmatically to just political posturing about who can claim victory on the wall, as Pat pointed out earlier. And what that means is that every American loses. We all lose when these become merely political footballs that are thrown back and forth. Make sure to follow me on Instagram. I'm on Instagram at david.pakman. Also on the David Pakman Show Instagram page, we have a very funny photo collage. I'm actually calling it a photo essay from producer Pat of producer Max having string cheese at David Pakman Show Studios. And it was Max's birthday earlier this week. And to celebrate Max's birthday on the at David Pakman Show Instagram account, there's a photo essay by producer Pat, which I am just calling, Pat, String Cheese 2019 is how I like to describe it.
And shout out to producer Max. I would say that he is on the Mount Rushmore of current David Pakman Show producers.
Yes, and he's the only person on that proverbial Mount Rushmore, interestingly enough. All right, let's take a break. We are going to talk next about FOMO, the fear of missing out. And it's going to be a really great interview coming up in mere minutes after this quick break.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to welcome to the program today Sven Brinkmann, who is a professor of psychology at the University of Aalborg, Denmark, also author of books including Stand Firm and The Joy of Missing Out. Sven, it's really great to speak to you today.
Well, I'm glad that you invited me. Thank you.
So let's talk a little bit about the joy of missing out and sort of the other side of that, which is the fear of missing out, or FOMO, as many Americans now sort of understand the term. First and foremost, what are we really describing when we talk about the fear of missing out? What's happening sort of psychologically that influences people?
Yeah. I mean, the fear of missing out is sort of a mentality that we have developed in our consumer society, I would say, with a constant doubt about what we are doing, what we are consuming, what we are buying, whom we are with in marriages and relationships, our jobs. No matter what we do, we can pose the question to ourselves, is this the right thing for me? And that, gives this fear, the question, am I missing out on something that is more important, that could potentially, be important to me, realize my inner potentials to grow as a person or something like that. And in addition, we have developed, as we all know now, technologies, digital technologies in particular, social media, that enable us to access almost anything all the time, our relationships, news, knowledge about all sorts of things. So all these things taken together really gives us this fear of missing out in the short term, but also in the longer term in our lives. And it's deeply dissatisfying to us. It makes us unhappy, it makes us miserable, and it's really difficult to do something about because it's so ingrained in our culture and in our technologies.
So I want to get in a second to the way in which modern technology is making this worse. But before we do that, thinking back a little bit, is there any way that this fear of missing out might have at some point in human history been some kind of an evolutionary advantage? Is that a possibility?
Yeah, it certainly is. It's always a bit risky to speculate about what life was like 200,000 years ago in East Africa. And, we have all the myths of evolutionary psychology. I'm absolutely certain that we come from East Africa, so to say, but it's not given how much we can actually take from the knowledge of human beings as a species and conclude about current life today. But I guess you're right that, our activities as explorers of this world, what's around the next hill, is an important evolutionary motor, if you will. And of course, this was developed in times when resources were scarce, where we had to struggle and fight to obtain goods and food and all sorts of things that we need to survive. But now all these things are not scarce, at least not in most parts of the world. We have plenty of resources, and I'm not just talking about food, but all sorts of products, knowledges, consumer goods of all kinds. So the problem is really something else. It's how to develop the art of self-restraint, the art of missing out, and saying no to all these invitations that we're constantly faced with.
Yeah, so like in my professional life, at several years ago, I would basically say yes to everything. Part of it was the fear that whatever I turned down was going to be like the big break, the opportunity to sort of get to the next level. And over time, partially because of the growth of my program, but also because I've just kind of developed as a person, I'm much more comfortable saying no to things. But what I think might have been useful to me 7 or 8 years ago would have been some kind of a system to better evaluate when should you say yes and when should you say no. So like what might be an infrastructure that people could apply to their lives to better decide what it makes sense to do and what it makes sense to pass on?
Yeah, no, this is an extremely important question in my view. We see now all sorts of programs like, simple living 10 or 15 years ago is now being rehabilitated. We have Marie Kondo,
yes,
talking about decluttering your life. We have books about, the art of saying no. And so this has become quite a trend, and I think it's important. I think we should listen to these voices because they really do speak to something important in our times. But what I would like to see and what I hope will happen is that we discuss these things with some sort of ethical foundation, with some sort of value basis. And just to give one example, and I don't mean to say anything about Marie Kondo, but the question she wants us to pose when we pick up our objects is, does it spark joy in me? And now this is a good question in a way, but what if this joy is momentary? Or what if it doesn't spark joy in me now, but it might tomorrow, or I might have other reasons to keep this object, maybe because it represents some symbolic value related to my family or my history or whatever. I think we can only answer these questions and develop the system that you rightly long for in a way. If we understand that humans have commitments, we have obligations, and these obligations and commitments are basically what structure or should structure our lives if we are to develop this art of self-restraint, as I like to call it. It's not just a matter of doing as little as possible and saying no to all sorts of things. It's about, as I see it, moderation. Balancing between too much on the one side and too little on the other. And I really think that, ethics, moral philosophy can help us arbitrate and navigate in these matters.
One of the terms that I've discussed before with my audience is the term hedonic adaptation, which is often applied to the cost of one's lifestyle. In other words, if you're used to a $50,000 a year lifestyle, and then you get a raise to $100,000, and everything in your life is adjusted to go with a $100,000 lifestyle. At a certain point, that will become your new baseline, and you will not really experience any subjective well-being that is different from the $50,000 a year lifestyle. Does that term apply to the fear of missing out and the idea that if you start doing much more, that becomes your baseline and you don't really feel any better?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do discuss this a bit in the book. The fact, as you say, that we strive for something, we might obtain it, and then we get used to it. And we just develop a new baseline of happiness or contentment or subjective well-being. That seems to be part of the human condition. And now we talked earlier about our evolutionary past. And in evolutionary terms, this is highly useful because it means that if we experience some trauma, some loss, some tragedy, we actually, most of us, quite quickly bounce back to the baseline level. And that's quite good for us. So we can keep on living and producing and nurturing our offspring and so on. But it's not good news when we talk about peak experiences, joys and good surprises like winning in the lottery and stuff like that, because those joys are just as momentary, and we will quickly, fall back to some baseline of happiness. And then we might begin to wonder, is something wrong with me? I just won the lottery. I just got the job that I wanted. My girlfriend just agreed to marry me. And I might be happy for a week or two, and then everything is back to normal. And I think it will be very difficult to break free from this hedonic treadmill, as some people also like to call it. But I think at least we can realize that it's a fact of human nature. It's a basic fact of our psychology. And then we might be content. We might not explode with despair when realizing that why do I not have these huge bursts of happiness when all these good things have happened to me? Well, because that's just life. Most of our lives, we live in some sort of middle gray area concerning happiness, and that's just as it should be. So maybe we shouldn't focus so much on super happiness, the subjective well-being. Maybe we should focus more, as I said before, on values, on ethics, on what is meaningful. I think that is a much more useful and practical approach to life, trying to figure out what is meaningful, how to nurture your relationships, how to live up to the obligations we have to other people, and doing important projects in our lives. And then from time to time, we will feel these, bursts of happiness and joy, but more as a side effect. I'm very suspicious that we can, chase these peak experiences of happiness directly. I think when they appear as side effects of, truly meaningful human activities. But, and this is mainly what my book is about, it has become very difficult to focus on these meaningful human activities because of the fear of missing out, because of all the noise that we hear, all the invitations we get from social media, from commercials, in this consumer society that we have created for ourselves.
So in the sort of limited time that we have left, can you now get specifically into how social media and the sort of scrolling social websites like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram are worsening this problem?
Yeah, it's sort of a technology designed, like so much else in our consumer societies, to make us dissatisfied with what we have. We can never say when we scroll down a Facebook feed or something like that, now I know enough. Now I don't have to know anything else, because there's always something else to see, to click, to like, to explore. So it's really designed to make us unhappy with what we have and what we see, and to go and hunt more. And that is, exploiting the general mechanism that we have as humans, and that we have seen in the past, 200 years really being articulated and developed with consumer society, that if you're happy with what you have, if you're satisfied, you really suffer from, a vice. It used to be a virtue to be able to say, well, I'm happy, I'm content. But if you're happy and content, then you no longer, feed into the machinery of the industry and so on. And so you need more, you need something else. Yes, the social media and the digital technologies are simply just a very visible symptom of that. I remember one ad from, Intercontinental Hotel, the big hotel, chains of hotel. And it said, you can't have a favorite place until you've seen them all. Mm. And this is like the poetry of capitalism, right? It really tells us something true in quite a poetic form, but also something quite tragic, because the message really is, you can never have a favorite place because you can never see them all. And try to translate that into jobs, into life projects, into relationships. You can never have a favorite partner until you've had them all. Well, obviously that's meaningless, but maybe that's what we are thinking, because it's what we have been taught to think when developing this fear of missing out.
We've been speaking with Sven Brinkmann, who is professor of psychology at the University of Aalborg, Denmark, also author of the book Stand Firm and the Joy of Missing Out. Sven, really a pleasure having you on.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Okay, I want to talk today about something called the narcissism of small differences, or the narcissism of minor differences, as it's sometimes known. And this, with the announcement that Bernie Sanders is running, he's now in the 2020 primary, it's a really important conversation for the left to have. And it's an important conversation because of some of the factions that are developing on the left. In short terms, in sort of like the briefest way to define this, the narcissism of small differences is when the small differences that separate certain people are overstated to such a degree that they appear to be massive differences and cause conflict when there really doesn't need to be any conflict. This goes back to the 1920s and Freud, actually, but there's lots of different interpretations as to where this originally comes from. But the idea is we become narcissistic about our own views on small differences with other people. Why this exists is open to some interpretation. There's one idea, more from Freud, that there's a kind of satisfaction to humans of an inclination to aggression, a mild inclination to aggression. And if it seems like we agree on 95% of stuff, of political issues, for example, something in us becomes satisfied when we find something we can be aggressive about or hostile about with other people. So we focus disproportionately on the 5% difference rather than the 95% agreement or similarity. Another idea about where the narcissism of small differences comes from is that there's just a kind of general desire to be different. And so when we see that we have a lot in common with someone else, we have a resistance to feeling that we're just like them. So we will find small differences to argue about so that we feel unique. Christopher Hitchens had many interesting commentaries that sort of circled around this idea. The reason that this matters is that when you become consumed by minor differences, things start to become exclusionary. I'm separate from those who have this minor disagreement with me. And we start to focus on the trivial and kind of miss the forest for the trees, to use a metaphor. So let's now look, starting with the 2020 primary, at how this is starting to manifest already. It's a primary, right? So we've got to make a choice between the options. We do have some duty to figure out what are the differences between the candidates. And there are important differences, but then there's also minor differences that are not, practically speaking, super important. Let's look, for example, at Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. On policy positions, Bernie and Elizabeth Warren are very, very similar in terms of where they've ended up. Now, I've pointed out to you, Elizabeth Warren comes from the center more and has been pulled to the left. Bernie comes from more of a left socialism perspective and has been pulled towards pragmatism. He and Elizabeth Warren have basically ended up in the same place on most policies, not on all. Great. We don't have to go crazy arguing about Warren versus Bernie in the destructive way that I'm already starting to see friends do on Facebook. They're two of the leftmost candidates. They are arguably the two leftmost members of the United States Senate. If either of them won the primary, I would gladly vote for either. Let's not allow narcissism over small differences to cloud that they're not only obviously better than Donald Trump, but they're mostly better than a lot of the other Democratic candidates as well. In geopolitics, we have lots of examples of the narcissism of small differences. The partition of India and Pakistan is an example that maybe is less well known, but a good example. I'll take this head on. Let's look at an example that's related to me. There are people on the left who disagree with me about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Let's explore this like adults for a second, since I know many of you are probably already thinking about that. How significant are our differences really in practice? I would imagine that I and most of my audience agrees that the current Israeli-Palestinian status quo is unacceptable. I imagine that we mostly agree that Benjamin Netanyahu is not going to be an arbiter of peace in the Middle East. I think we all basically agree that the Palestinian people are being treated like crap as a result of what's going on, and we need the most direct path to ending that we can possibly find. I would assume my audience and I mostly agree that the blockade on Gaza has to be lifted as a top priority of whatever agreement is made as soon as an agreement is possible. On settlements, I think my audience mostly agrees with me that new settlements must stop and as many as reasonably possible are going to have to be dismantled as part of an eventual long-term peace deal. Where might we disagree? I've said that I think there are probably some settlements that might have to be land swapped in an eventual agreement. Maybe some people in the audience disagree with me about that, but it's a relatively minor difference. My audience and I are, I believe, on the same page in opposition of moving the American embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So in the end, the differences are relatively minor, but there is a tendency to focus on those differences, overstate them, and end up losing all possibility of sensible conversation on that basis. So what does this mean for 2020? What does this mean for the left going forward? What this, I think, means, what I think the takeaway has to be, is let's understand that in general, the narcissism of small differences is something that can be destructive. Let's further our understanding, even in just thinking back to the interview that I just did, that social media makes this way worse because it leads to a situation where oftentimes people are interacting on social media only on the basis of the small disagreements. You're not likely to tweet back and forth with people or to simply comment on YouTube about how you agree about 95% on about 95% of issues with someone else that's on YouTube or on Twitter. You're likely to engage only on those small differences, and that just exacerbates the problem. And the last thing I will say is that as important as it is not to fall into the trap of the narcissism of small differences, let's not mistake real differences as small, right? So one example, Trump versus Hillary, as we are now seeing with the embarrassment of the U.S. on the world stage, the Supreme Court decisions that Donald Trump has made and everything else, some people incorrectly assessed the difference between Trump and Hillary as small in 2016. That's also a danger. We have to recognize serious differences where they exist. Look forward to hearing from you about this. My favorite visual of the week, other than Donald Trump at the omelet station at his golf club, is what happened at the Munich Security Conference when Mike Pence mentioned Donald Trump. And what happened is complete silence. I'm going to play a clip for you here where you will see Mike Pence, vice president in Munich, say, Lindsey Graham led this delegation to the Munich Security Conference. Let's thank him for that. And then you will hear clapping. And then Mike Pence will say, also Donald Trump. And then it's complete and total silence during what was supposed to be an applause line. And the audio is good enough, but if you're only listening on the radio or on the podcast, find the visual of this, because the visual just shows you the full scope of it. Pence sort of looks around. He's not sure. I mean, he said an applause line. Why is no one clapping? The reason is that the Mango Menace is increasingly an object of ridicule around the world. Let's take a look at the video.
I especially want to invite all of you to thank Senator Lindsey Graham for leading this delegation. And to them and to all of you, I bring greetings from a great champion of freedom and of strong national defense, who has worked with these members of Congress to strengthen America's military might and to strengthen the leadership of the free world. I bring greetings from the 45th President of the United States of America, President Donald Trump.
Oh, it is just the best. Everyone should be glad that the crowd didn't merely laugh at the mention of Trump's name. And what we're seeing here, it's just what's going on around the world when it comes to world leaders' view of Trump. It's mostly, who cares? Trump's contributing nothing positive internationally. And I know when we play this, Pat, that the committed Trumpists don't care. But this is part of that tenuous and strained relationship between the U.S. and European allies. When Pence shows up and says France, Germany, and the U.K. should pull out of the Iran nuclear deal because we did, world leaders recognize that if Iran doesn't violate the deal, which they didn't, it's a really bad idea to pull out. It makes the U.S. look bad. When they realize that there's no point in even inviting the United States Trump administration to participate in discussions related to climate change because Trump thinks it's a hoax. This is the point of view of the rest of the world increasingly, which is it's not even laughing. It's just who cares about Trump?
Part of the reason why that video is so great, it's because Mike Pence actually looks surprised. He's shocked that people aren't clapping. It shouldn't be a surprise at all, I don't think. Like, he should expect that European leaders are not going to be on his side in this one.
Yeah, U.S. diplomatic influence is on the decline. U.S. influence around the world is on the decline. We're no longer a part of the climate change conversation. The world knows that on geopolitics, Trump's priorities are completely backwards. He's compromised at minimum by Vladimir Putin, also possibly by Saudi Arabia. On technology, on high-speed trains, on all sorts of stuff, we are falling further and further behind. The dollar, as I've been telling you for a year now, is less and less the transactional and default currency for countries around the world. The world sees Trump, Pence as phonies, which they are. They have no business being in charge, but it's having a real-world impact, and it is an embarrassment when Trump administration delegates, including up to and including Mike Pence and Donald Trump themselves, it's an embarrassment around the world in the literal sense. The UN laughs. The Munich Security Conference simply doesn't even react to the applause line of the great champion of freedom and security, Donald Trump. It's an absolute and total embarrassment. Okay, I got a ton of emails, tweets, and YouTube comments yesterday when we covered Donald Trump getting food at Mar-a-Lago and this viral picture that we have after he declared a national emergency. I said he's at the omelet station. And a lot of people said, David, that's not how it's pronounced. One of those people was the Eggman, who we haven't heard from for a while. Here's what the Eggman said.
Hi, I'm calling to talk to Dave. English is my second language, Dave. It's pronounced omelet, not omelet. It does not have 3 syllables in it. Please, look, I don't mean to criticize you, but I just want you to tell me I'm not the only one who corrected you on that. You said it twice, omelet. Just, if you're not sure, just say it once and then run away from the mic and then wait till tomorrow to figure out how to say it. Don't double down on omelet. But anyway, shalom, brother. I'm going to go get a nice bacon, egg, and cheese omelet for breakfast. Yo.
Okay. Thank you, Eggman. Shalom to you. This is how I've always said it. And I think it may be because the word is really a French word. And in Argentina, in Spanish, it's basically the French pronunciation. So I guess do you say omelet? It would just never occur to say it to me that way, Pat.
You know, as a vegan, I think I'm going to stay out of this altogether. I don't eat omelettes. I don't know how to pronounce omelet. Either one works for me.
I will, I admit this is not a high priority for me to correct. I made an effort to fully understand fewer versus less. I made an effort to say Nevada and Hawaii as opposed to Nevada and Hawaii. And that's it. I think I'm going to continue saying omelet, and I love it. Okay, we've got a great bonus show for you today. I'm out of time, but it's a good one. Become a member, become a patron. Much more show coming up today if you want it. But you've got to listen to it or watch it on the bonus show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.